Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. There's more attention of late to the Arctic than has been in a long period of time, and so I thought it would be really helpful to check in with an expert, Alex Dalziel, who is an associate with the Integrity Lab at the University of Ottawa. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he works with the Canadian School of Public Service as well. Used to work in the Privy Council office, and so someone that I think knows a lot about what's going on. He's spoken at a few conferences of late. He's written a paper. He's been quoted in the media all about the Arctic. Alex, why are we spending so much time paying attention to the Arctic recently, finally?
Yeah, finally, I think you're right to use that term. There's a few reasons going on. I think, it's hard to say in the Canadian case that some of it doesn't lead back to the United States and the current turbulence in the relations over trade, over aspects of security that's mostly been attracted to fentanyl and organized crime. But, Canada-US cooperation in the North American Arctic has been the hallmark of defense and security there. And, it makes sense that we turn more attention to this. But I think, against this backdrop, we do have to keep in mind, that turbulence is a more recent phenomenon. We have a lot of institutions that can work to hopefully work through that turbulence. But the larger challenges of Russia and China have not gone away and have remained quite steady. The Arctic is of interest to them. Russia is the largest Arctic country. We can talk more about its ambitions, et cetera, in the Arctic, but by far has the biggest icebreaker fleet, now has Navy ships capable of handling ice. It continues to push a very strong Arctic line, partly for economic reasons, partly for what we would call geostrategic reasons, positioning itself in the world. At the same time, we have China, which, for a few years now has been talking about the Arctic more and more and acting more and more. It famously self-labeled itself, I believe in 2018, as a near Arctic state. This was a terminology that even the Russians rejected at the time. They use that a little less now, but the actions matter more than the words. They now have their fourth icebreaker in the water. We've seen Russian Chinese cooperation for Coast Guard aircraft, in the Northern Pacific and Bering Straits. And of course, last summer, one of our military frigates actually shadowed a Chinese vessel heading into the Arctic, ostensibly to do research. But there's always concerns in Washington, Ottawa, and our Nordic allies' capitals that perhaps more than research is going on.
You recently wrote a paper for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about our slow steps in the Arctic. Why are we taking slow steps of Arctic defense and security?
Well, so I think the core reasons are it's expensive and it's not been put by our leaders on the Canadian agenda, first and foremost for Canadians to think about. At the end of the day, the Arctic is a very large part of the Canadian territory. It's why we're the second largest country by geography in the world. Huge part of our coastline when you think of the network of islands that are up there. And a distinctive part of our culture, whether we think of the Inuit and First Nations who live there, the history of exploration that's gone on, et cetera. So, the Arctic, should have more importance to Canada, but for the most part, it's been treated more romantically, like it's part of our identity, but not one we have to invest in. And, this has also been part of, in the past, which was a diplomatic strategy that was, relatively successful, I would say, well, probably quite successful until 2022, of keeping the Arctic a high north, low tension was kind of the mantra. That's clearly changed since 2022. Maybe we should have been more aware as of 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine. But in 2022, that kind of period where we sort of tried to give Russia the benefit of the doubt became completely untenable after February 2022. So, that's highlighted again the need to work more in the Arctic, our own defense, work with allies. Then we have some other developments. Russia has developed new weapons, more modern versions of weapons that can be launched from or go through the Arctic, hypersonic missiles, some of these very cutting edge. That's really put the onus on updating the NORAD agreement that the NORAD treaty that Canada and the United States have to be better able to deal with those threats. That's mostly a matter of awareness in the Arctic. And I think that's the really important part for your viewers and listeners to keep in mind, that it's really Canada's ability to respond in the Arctic that's the key part. It's our situational awareness, as the military calls it. So like the sensors, the radars, the ships, other, the rangers, the peoples of the North who live there, being able to collect that information into a picture so that whether it's the Coast Guard or the RCMP or the Royal Canadian Navy, Royal Canadian Air Force can respond to something that develops there. So I think, a few of those changes, have brought the Arctic back into the forefront. And I would say this too. I mean, in this era where we're facing a lot of, pressure from the United States, pressure from our rivals, even friendly pressure from our NATO allies. Many of our Nordic neighbors, they've stepped up. I mean, they've stepped up to be over 3% of defense spending, are getting very close, with Denmark and even now Sweden pushing very hard towards that level. And these were countries, particularly Denmark and Sweden, that were at the same levels of defense spending or even lower than Canada, 5 or 6 years ago. So it does show it can be done if you put political will behind it. And maybe that's what we're starting to see, Brian. We're starting to see some signs of political will to make the case to Canadians that this is important.
95% of us or something like that live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. Why is the Arctic important?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I alluded to, I mean, first I would say as a basic responsibility of being Canadian, we have to take care of the territory that sits within our borders. I think that's a basic responsibility as good citizens, for the protection of our fellow citizens who live in the North, as well as its natural beauty, its resources, etc. But more specifically, in terms of the threats, as I mentioned, a lot of think about the Great Circle routes. I mean, anyone who's flown to Asia or flown to Europe knows planes don't go straight across the Atlantic. They kind of arc up and over. And this means, unfortunately, like we saw with the Chinese weather balloon a couple of years ago, that, espionage tools, aircraft, etc., even if they're trying to get to somewhere further south in North America, will actually pass through that space. So that makes it really, really important for Canada and the U.S. to work together if you want to protect that 95% of the population that lives close to the border, right? I mean, the sorts of, scariest threats from the Russian and Chinese and North Korean nuclear arsenals would travel that route. And as we saw again with that balloon, more benign but still threatening activities can also be conducted. There's also the issue. I mean, those are kind of the aerospace issues, right? Then there's the maritime, and I think this is the area where more and more attention needs to be put. In Canada, Senate and parliamentary committees have spoken to this. The ice is melting. That's not a linear pathway in the Canadian Arctic. That's actually complicating navigation up there. There was a study last year that really pointed to the fact that loose ice is actually in many ways more threatening than static ice, and you're now facing mixtures of what they call multi-year ice, so ice that's frozen over accumulation of years in the central Arctic Ocean, and first year ice. So this makes navigation very difficult. But there's no question that this dynamic has created of climate change and melt has created the perception amongst many and an increasing risk-taking appetite to look at ventures, whether they're shipping, whether they're like fiber optic cables that extend between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, fishing activities, and of course, the big one, critical minerals and energy, which, I mean, again, is another complicated discussion, but particularly in the Canadian North, whether that in fact is the first place Canadians need to be looking for those resources. But nonetheless, that's part of the economic development of the North and one that needs to be treated seriously. So I would say, again, if you're living in Southern Ontario, a lot of those factories, a lot of those industries are going to depend on things that could come from the North and can affect supply chain security, some of these big issues. And maybe that's the final point. Again, Canada has this Arctic identity. Other countries look at us to lead here. And the more we can kind of come up with a way that, talks about the Arctic in terms that work for Canadians, work for Northern Canadians, work for First Nations and Indigenous, the stronger we are internationally.
We're going to take a break. We're chatting about the Arctic in Canada, whether it's important to us, why it's important to us, what we need to be doing. And we've been taking some increased small steps, according to our expert tonight. Should we be doing more? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes, talking tonight about the Canadian Arctic. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. The topic tonight is the Canadian Arctic. Our expert, Alex Dalziel, who is an expert in geopolitical analysis, assessment, risk, strategic intelligence, expert insight, etc. A managing director with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who's written several articles of late about the Arctic. You also have commented that you think that the election has focused on the Arctic for the first time in a long time. Why is that? And tell me what you think the different positions of the different parties are in regards to the Arctic. I understand all three leaders have recently visited the Arctic, which would be sort of a first time ever.
Mm-hmm. Well, I should say that, I mean, I don't think they focus near enough on defense and security, even in the context we're in. But, you know, it's more on the agenda, and Canadians want it to be on the agenda to talk about this. So what we've seen, you know, are visits to Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, from both, from three: Prime Minister Carney, leader of the opposition, leader of the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, and leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. And, you know, they've all talked about different aspects of defense and security from there, and really made defense and security part of the dialogue that they've had up there. And I should add, they've also made infrastructure, and infrastructure, I think, is an important aspect, civilian infrastructure, that also contributes to security. Because, I mean, you have to think about the security of, you know, very broadly speaking, in places in the Arctic, which are often at the end of very long supply chains for food, for real fundamentals that we take for granted in the south of Canada. So I think we've seen, you know, I mean, what I like about what's going on is that ideas are being put forward, and they're being put forward in the public domain. We saw Mr. Poilievre talk about, perhaps, instead of building two polar class icebreakers, these are the strongest, most powerful icebreakers that can linger in, you know, multi-year ice in the central Arctic Ocean, can basically be there all year round. Perhaps doubling. We're planning to build two, maybe build four. He's talked about maybe Iqaluit being some sort of Canadian Forces base, et cetera. Some ideas. We saw Prime Minister Carney use it as a platform to announce an important step in the NORAD modernization plan, which has existed since 2022. But a key part of that was getting a new radar system to support NORAD, and we're doing that with the Australians. So I think that's a notable thing. He announced other money towards increasing the presence of the Canadian Armed Forces in the Arctic. Mr. Singh used it more for an opportunity to talk about the F-35 procurement, et cetera, and whether that's still a good idea given the current turbulence with the United States. So again, we've seen them choose the Arctic, which I think is significant symbolically and in terms of policy direction, that they realize this is something we need to be talking about. And it's important to have Northerners by your side, talking about the Rangers, meeting with the Rangers. You know, the Rangers are one of the key institutions for your listeners in the North, a kind of reserve military force, mostly made up of, well, it actually extends across Canada, but you think of the North when you think of it. Key way that the military interacts with Inuit populations, with First Nations, et cetera. So I think that discussion is good. I think what's missing in the discussion, O'Brien, is that we really need a strategy. Sometimes you feel there's a little bit of a Band-Aid kind of going on here. And of course, you know, the politicians will spin. That's what they do. You know, I'm happy with Mr. Carney announcing the radar, but I mean, this is not a new announcement. This is the procurement moving forward. No small thing in a Canadian environment where procurement is typically overdue and overpriced in the end, or at least over budget. So that part has been important. So I think they're realizing
I live close to the Eglinton Crosstown. Let me tell you about the time it takes to get procurement actually open and running.
Well, this depends, you know, really on, you know, actually it depends really on political will, right? So it took us how many years to buy the F-35 fighter plane? I mean, something like 15 to 20. I mean, it was really a political football, but when when it was finally decided, it got done. And I mean, very similar to the recent announcements around the new River class frigates for the Navy, all of a sudden it's done. On the submarine procurement, we're trying to replace the 4 submarines we have, potentially with a much larger fleet of 12. That seems to have been given more direct push. So it's moving faster. I mean, it's in a very early phase. I mean, it's going to be 12, 15 years before we get one in the water. But that's the way those procurements work. They take a long time to design, to build, and to put into place, even if you don't have a lot of political noise. But then we have lots of very disappointing examples, from the last few years under the Trudeau government of where, getting manufacturing lines for artillery shells, for instance, for Ukraine, which needs them desperately, has been treated very, very slowly, caught up. There's other plans to, Jeeps and modernizing some other equipment, totally caught up in slow procurement. So it makes some things, as my colleague Rob Hubert will say, I mean, the icebreakers that have recently been announced, you can actually take a timeline back to 1985 if you want to say how long it's taken for us to get to the point where we're building new polar icebreakers.
This is off topic, but why the heck does procurement take so long? Like we seem completely obsessed with process and not with getting things done.
Right. Well, again, I'll just go back to political will. Like when there's political will, we can do things very, very quickly. And I think, the military, defense, national security has been on the back burner, I mean, really since 1991, if you want to be strictly speaking. But I think certainly over the, Harper and Trudeau governments, I mean, military was not seen as a primary thing. And I think that's been especially acute in these
So in the liberal leadership debates, there was this debate about whether getting up to 2% of GDP spending was possible in 2030 or 2027. And some of the people said, no, you just can't do it in 2026 or 2027. It's impossible. Could you actually, with political will, get up to that kind of spending effectively and efficiently in a year?
Well, I think the effectively and efficiently is the important part. These are at the end of the day big procurements. You don't want to just buy things for the sake of buying things, right? So I mean, you do want a degree of consideration, and that goes back to what I talked about having a plan. I mean, there is a very broad-based plan in the Our North Strong and Free defense policy that came out last year. But that doesn't, necessarily get into the nuts and bolts of what you need at every point to execute that. So, I mean, certainly to get to like 2% by 2026, 2027, I think you do want to say, okay, well, what are we buying? What need does it address, et cetera? But I think as I mentioned, our Danish and Swedish allies have shown, you can get a plan in place with, saying we want these capabilities. We plan to buy these capabilities, and here's the timeline. I mean, that was even a struggle under the Trudeau government to get that level of commitment. And I should add that, I mean, the 2% debate is yesterday's debate. Like it is not a 2%. Like we need to be getting to like minimum 2.5 and more likely 3 and perhaps above by 2030, 2032. The chief of defense staff said when she took over the role, we got 5 years to get this right. That sounds about, that was a year ago, almost. So I think, we definitely need to be saying by 2030, we've got, we're procuring these technologies, these abilities, and it's not, I mean, I should also add here, I mean, the procurement can easily get caught up. We have problems with retention in the military. We have problems with recruitment in the military. We need to make this a more attractive choice. And we have this upwelling of patriotism right now, so that should be possible. So there's a lot of issues, I think, over the neglect of the Canadian military. And I mean, again, these come back to political inattention. And I think, frankly, if I'm very blunt, our political leadership, especially over these last 9 years, not speaking clearly to Canadians about the threats that exist in this world. And this is not a partisan statement. Certainly the Liberals were in charge, so the responsibility rests on their shoulders. But I think we've seen a reluctance from Mr. Poilievre and others to point out that the world is becoming a much more unstable and uncertain place, and Canada has many different things it can do. It's not all just about tax cuts. It's not all about dental plans. We have to be thinking more about building this country to be ready for the threats that exist outside of it.
You reposted the other day a speech by the Danish foreign minister that said some of the effect of the status quo is not possible. We have to change. Are other Arctic neighbors doing things differently that we should be looking to as an examples of what we should be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at all the Nordic countries, especially the big ones, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, they have all raised their defense spending. I mean, Finland had a very strong tradition of, has a huge reserve force. It never really preparedness. What I think was particularly striking with Sweden and Denmark and Norway is that not only are they beefing up capabilities, whether that's F-35 procurements, fighter planes, the Gripen fighter plane that competed for that, for our fighter plane in Canada, which Sweden builds. They have quite a large air force to the size of their country. A lot of these countries bring quite a bit of capability. And, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, over the last couple of years has really given a push to thinking more about what is called the northern flank in NATO. And it's notable that we've adopted this terminology as well, which we can come back to in terms of Canadian foreign policy and how we think about that. But they're all certainly doing things to improve their capabilities, build up their submarine fleets, build up their air forces, but also building up their civilian preparedness. And I mean, their model is going to be different. I mean, they have a different political system. Obviously, their proximity to Russia puts a real onus on this. I mean, they could literally have a land war. Like the chances of us having a land war in the Arctic are very low. But for them, it's a real, contingency. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a reality, but they fear that, that after, especially a bad peace treaty in Ukraine, that within 5 years, the Russian military will have rebuilt and present more of a threat to their borders. So, I think seriousness of purpose is the big thing. I mean, it's notable with the Danish foreign minister's comments, et cetera. I mean, it's laying out some of the things that they could do with the Americans in Greenland. They have literally, since 2022, I should add, but, have rapidly moved up to be well over 2%, I think 2.6. And with the newest announcements they've made, they're headed to 3% and over.
Since you mentioned Greenland, I got to ask, what do you think about Vice President Vance's visit to Greenland and Donald Trump's comments about it's going to happen? We're going to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. I think it was a huge missed opportunity historically, Mr. Vice President Vance's visit. I'll tell you why. We've seen this. I mean, obviously, interfering in the political affairs of a ally, the Greenland, for your listeners and viewers, is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So it has a lot of autonomy, basically runs all of its domestic affairs, but foreign policy, defense, those things, national security remain under Copenhagen's responsibility. But increasingly, Copenhagen involves Greenland at NATO in many discussions that cut across domestic and international lines. So, I don't think that the conversation has been overly productive. It is no doubt true, and President Trump is right to point to this, that Greenland is a very important part of North American security for some of the reasons I mentioned to you earlier. That's in Canada's northeast, big swath of territory. If you've ever flown to Europe, you've probably gazed out the window and looked at the incredible landscape of Greenland. And sea lanes, in the Second World War, et cetera. I mean, maintaining, at least keeping, the Nazis out of there was key to weather stations, just keeping North Atlantic shipping safe. So some of those things have not changed in importance. But as I mentioned, there's more technology, the melting ice, et cetera. But I'd say it's a missed opportunity because, if that had really happened in a way that was working with allies constructively, Vice President Vance could have had the, Prime Minister of Greenland, the Prime Minister of Denmark, ideally the Prime Minister of Canada, maybe even the Prime Minister or a senior official from Iceland, putting forward an idea to have a new North American security pact in the North and how we're going to achieve that. And I think that's where the conversation, there was a very telling moment in that interview in his speech and in the questions when asked, like, okay, well, what are the U.S.'s plans to increase presence? He said, well, we don't really have any. We may do some investments in the base they have way up in the north where he visited. But I mean, again, this to me shows that there needs to be more depth of ideas. Canada can play a role here. We have the strong, Greenland is a majority Inuit country. The language is very, very similar to what's spoken amongst Inuit communities in the Canadian North. There's a lot of connections we can build on there. Canada's a mining power. One of the big things that seems to be interesting to, or, interesting to President Trump is the mineral resources, which are significant but are expensive and hard to access. So Canada can certainly be involved in that to our mutual benefit, and hopefully our three different countries can benefit from that. And when it comes again to managing sea lanes in the Davis Strait, on the East Coast, I think Canada should be thinking quite a bit about what can we do militarily, what can we do in terms of Coast Guard, but it has to be in cooperation with Greenlandic authorities and Danish authorities.
What's your prediction? Will the United States take over Greenland?
A betting man, I would say that the challenges of that will be very huge. It would rupture the relationship with Europe in a very, very serious way. I think everything that the U.S. wants here, it can get. It has a treaty with Denmark that has been updated to have more Greenlandic involvement that dates back to 1951. The U.S. can put bases, in discussion, of course, in consultation with the people who live there. To expand the U.S. military presence. When it comes to extracting critical minerals, the U.S., as it actually has been doing since the first Trump administration, at least since the first Trump administration and through the Biden one, can cooperate with Greenlandic authorities on how to extract those. But when you look at the problems that Greenland has had with mining, they have one of the biggest rare earth deposits in the world, known deposits in the world in the south. But one of the byproducts of mining there was going to be uranium. And the people of Greenland are very, have a very strong attitude against nuclear, against uranium, etc. So they were, eventually that mining project was closed down by the government or the prospecting. That sort of thing, again, unless you're going to run over the will of the people who live there, is U.S. ownership is not going to help this. I mean, I think at the end of the day, most Americans are not very taken by the idea of owning it outright. I mean, they would have to pay for a lot of things that the Danes currently cover. So, I think the political winds will blow against this, but I don't predict President Trump because that's a fool's errand, I think.
We're chatting tonight about the Arctic and what we should be doing. When we come back after a couple of minutes for messages, I'm going to ask our guest, Alex Dalziel, about the Northwest Passage, about military bases, about submarines, some of the specifics that people have been talking about and what, if anything, we should be doing. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. The topic tonight is the Canadian Arctic. Our guest is Alex Dalziel, who is an expert on the Arctic. He is a managing director with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's written a couple of articles of late, and you've attended a couple of conferences. And so we've talked about how there's political interest. Is there actual, are these regular conferences we never hear about, or are these conferences starting to actually have some impact?
Well, I think there is starting to be more stuff in Canada with more attention. We've always had a academic community at our universities and Canadians abroad who have really deep expertise in the Arctic. So there's the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, which exists in Canada and has international, which is very strong. The conference I spoke at was a newer network, the East Europe and Transatlantic Network Conference. And they talked about lots of different things at that conference, disinformation, other aspects of, politics in Central Asia, Ukraine, these things. But they dedicated a panel to the Arctic. And I think you're going to see this more and more, the discussion of the Arctic coming up as a regular feature in universities, in organizations like the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and others, talking about the Arctic as an important part.
We all learned about the Northwest Passage back in geography in high school. Is it now actually becoming a real thing?
Well, I think you have to be very cautious. The sea lanes up there are very important to the communities. It's how they get diesel, which is how they get most of their electricity. Of course, it's part of how they get food, equipment, etc. Much is flown in. So it's, and it's a core part of people's lives up there. But if you're thinking about the Northwest Passage as a way to, do shipping between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, that's still some way off. The ice conditions there have always been difficult and forbidding, and they continue to be actually, more dynamic. But what we are seeing is far more ships, cruise ships are up there quite a bit. So we do need to be thinking about that, about search and rescue, making sure our Coast Guard and the Canadian Air Force has the tools they need to reach people in distress and to make sure that institutions like the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary, et cetera, have the equipment they need because they're the local first responders, right? If there is an accident, so I think we do need to be thinking about it in terms of what we do, for Canada to keep it safe. But some of that safe is actually more about running into a piece of ice or not having the proper charts to sail and not run aground, as opposed to necessarily thinking that this is a bumper opportunity to have, huge container ships running through that somehow replace the Suez Canal or something.
I understand the U.S. hasn't actually recognized Canadian sovereignty of all of the water passageways amongst the islands. Is that an issue?
Well, it is an issue. It's one that Canada and the U.S. have handled very, very well over the years. We disagree. The U.S. is a big proponent of freedom of navigation and doesn't believe that, pathways between one ocean or another, or one body of water and another, can be national, domestic areas. Canada disagrees completely with this position.
Well,
Canada says these are
so
historic.
Panama, I guess.
Well, Panama, yeah. I mean, that's the Panama Canal, of course, is a hugely significant piece, and that's another part of the, pressure we've seen from the United States. I mean, it's of huge significance to the global economy. Certainly, the Northwest Passage is nowhere near that. The real interest, I think, with the Northwest Passage, at the end of the day, Canada says they're historic internal waters, right? And I think the case is quite strong for that. But that's kind of an ongoing rub. I think interesting point here is that the Russians have the same attitude about the Northeast Passage, that runs across their northern territory. The Northern Sea Route, part of it is called. The Chinese disagree with that view, but the Russians and Chinese are cooperating there quite a bit. So these can, I think the Canada-US example, the China-Russia example, show that these differences can actually be managed. Let's see. Again, unpredictable, from the Trump administration, but let's hope that the diplomats sort that one out and we don't see that one in the headlines.
A couple of years ago, there was this big controversy about a Chinese company wanting to buy a sizable mine that was very close to a Canadian military establishment. Should we be worried about foreign direct investment, particularly of critical minerals in the north?
Well, it depends where it's from. I think we should be very open to it when it comes from our Nordic and European partners, from the Japanese, Australians. We should be thinking about secure supply chains, and we should be, making sure that the sources for those are as broad as possible. I do think that we need to look very carefully at Chinese investments in the north, especially when they have those angles. At the end of the day, even if it's mined by, if a Chinese company, if all what the industry calls the offtake agreement, so basically taking the ore is sent to China for processing, this is where the actual problem is largely right now, is that for rare earth elements, critical minerals, these things are very important for defense, for digital technology, and for new energy technologies, depend on some of these minerals. And they're almost all, China has a chokehold on many of these. So we need to get the processing sorted out. So I think Canadians should still be very open to foreign direct investment, but we do need to think about who owns and where those, where are the ores being taken.
4 or 12 submarines. Is that enough for a country that's got 3 oceans bordering it?
So, I think this is kind of a general theme that, in the paper, the pole position paper from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I spoke to the slow progress. The Canadian Navy has made slow progress, right? The Harry DeWolf class of ships, sometimes known as the AOPS, these have some ice capability. The Canadian Navy did not have that before. So that's an improvement. The submarines, of course, that's tripling the size of the fleet. And given the challenges that the current submarine fleet has had with staying at sea, I think it's a realistic number. If you're thinking purely strategically, but Brian, again, the history of Canadian procurements on submarines, it's up to is the language. So, the chance that we end up with fewer is quite possible. Canada's a country of 40 million people. So, we could, we're not small in the NATO context. We're a wealthy country. But, at the end of the day, it's a huge territory. I think 12 would be certainly a, 4 in the Atlantic, 4 in the Pacific, and 4 looking at parts of the Arctic. But the submarines being talked about, I should add, will not have full under ice capability. They will be able to do way more than the current fleet can do. So Canada will have to, and I don't think that's the end of the world. We don't want to get into the whole nuclear submarine discussion right now because it'll take 50 years to actually get a boat from that program.
50 years to get a nuclear submarine?
I wouldn't be. I mean, look at these challenges the Australians have had. Maybe I'm being a little bit over exaggerating, but I mean, it would certainly be 2 to 3 decades, right? I mean,
Why?
well, the amount of infrastructure you need to support nuclear submarines is very, very large. Besides the technology being limited, for the most part to the Americans. I mean, even a lot of the British technology derives from that. So it takes a lot to train, maintain those vessels. So it's not just a matter of buying the boat. You have to buy a lot of other things that are completely distinct to separating it. So I can't quite recall off the top of my head what the Australians are who are now buying nuclear, but the timelines are way out there. So, we can hopefully have a conventional submarine in the water in 12 to 15 years. Even that is going to take real political will and push. That's why I think we should have someone in the Prime Minister's office who worries about these procurements, who's responsible directly to the Prime Minister to say, we need these, and here's where they're at, right now, and this is what needs to be done to fix any problems in the process, to moving them forward. But they're complicated ships, the nuclear ones. So I think, again, we need capability now. A lot of the conventional ones, can operate. What they're talking about is like 2 to 3 weeks that they'd be able to operate. They might not be able to smash through the ice. They would have ability to operate in the choke points. Again, you have to think kind of a little bit. It's the efficiency part of this. Where can you have the most effect? So I think that's, a decent plan going forward.
What should we be doing on icebreakers?
Well, icebreakers, again, for some strange reason, the Trudeau government buried the kind of announcement about the two new polar icebreakers, one being built in Vancouver, one being built in Quebec. This is great news. I mean, it's great news that these are finally being constructed. Mr. Poilievre's suggestion that we should build more, I think should be seriously considered. I mean, do we need four? I don't think would need much more than four, but three? I mean, it depends a little bit more on, operational tempo, as Coast Guard and Navy would say. How often these ships need maintenance. They operate in very difficult conditions for cold, for ice. So I think that conversation is there. What I think is really interesting here is what we can do internationally with our U.S. allies, with our Finnish allies. You may be aware we have this ice pact, kind of an industrial cooperation agreement between Canada, the United States, and Finland. Finland is the world leader in building icebreakers, and a Canadian company now owns one of the shipyards there. We should be thinking very hard about how we can meet our collective needs through collective capacity, and icebreaking is one of those areas.
There seemed to be a little bit of a controversy between the need for one military base versus two military bases in the Arctic. What's that issue, sir?
Well, I think everything comes down to what you mean by base. If you're talking about a full Canadian Forces base, we already have some. I mean, Canadian Forces Base Alert, the most northern base in the world, at the north top of Ellesmere Island. What we really need are, sometimes they're called operational support hubs. We need more footprint. We need places that ships can stop to change crews, to get refueled, to rearm if necessary. We need places where F-35s and the tanker aircraft that they connect to in the air to refuel, mid-air refueling, where they can land and be refueled and supplied. It's more the ability to be able to take things that we have in the south and actually deploy them to the north. So I don't think it necessarily entails having a Canadian Forces base full blown in every instance, but it does mean having more infrastructure that really should be able to handle the Coast Guard as well, fisheries patrols. A lot of these things are going to be very, very important in the future. So we just need more infrastructure. And, the positive thing in Canada is, and I'll give credit to the Trudeau government for this, is that the discussion around reconciliation, I think, has really reached a point where, Indigenous companies are not just, and communities are not just involved for, you don't just consult, but you co-develop. And I think we should very much take that same attitude here, that, how can this be developed in ways that improves the civilian infrastructure, gets better access to clean water, better access to sewage, better access to transportation, digital access. That's really what we need to be thinking.
The Prime Minister, the leader of the Liberal Party, Mark Carney, went up to the north and made a big deal of social infrastructure as well. Was that relevant? What's the issue there?
Well, the issue there is that, Northern Canadians still face, situation for, like, as I said, clean water, et cetera, that, I mean, would not be acceptable in much of southern Canada. I mean, these problems still continue across, many Indigenous communities and what they face. Most electricity generated in the Canadian Arctic is generated from diesel. So, I mean, it's expensive to get it there. Of course, it burns dirty. The green transition, so talked about. I mean, things like wind, solar. I mean, there's nonstop sun for 6 months of the year for some places. Even small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, et cetera. There's a lot of need to improve the access to basic necessities that northern communities need. So I actually think, again, we need to have our government officials and our political leaders talking very much about how these things can work together. To spread the costs, right? To say, okay, this isn't just Environment Canada, this isn't just the Department of National Defense, this isn't just, the Coast Guard. We have to be thinking about how to kind of collectively put some of these things together. And I think, the benefits to making sure that our fellow Canadians in the North, are able to access clean water, digital technology, digital access, is very big for the national project. And I think this is what we need to be talking more and more about. How do we build Canada and make it stronger?
The national project. I like that. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments with our guest, Alex Dalziel, about what our strategy should be in the Canadian Arctic in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm chatting tonight with Alex Dalziel from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert on Arctic sovereignty, military investment, etc. Alex, I want to ask you a question. I've been involved in business for a couple of decades, and I've traveled not all the world, but a lot of the world. And I've been to Anchorage, looking at investment opportunities and industrial opportunities and retail, real estate opportunities. I've been to a couple of towns in Bristol Bay, and I was impressed with the economic development in Alaska. I've never gone to the north. The farthest north in Canada I've been is Fort McMurray, and that's still in Alberta. It's not even in the north. And Fort McMurray, I understand, is the most northern point where there's actually paved roads, continuous paved roads from the balance of Canada up to, other than the Alaskan Highway. Do we have enough attention in Canada from a business standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a tourism standpoint on the north? And if not, why? Why do I have this impression, based on my own personal situation, that the U.S. has a lot more activity in Alaska? Is Alaska, more resource strong and more developed than the North? What have we done wrong, if we've done something wrong?
Well, I think of a comment that my colleague Heather Exner-Perot has made, that Canada does not have, or did not have at the time she made this comment, that a single economist who focuses on the Arctic. I mean, you would, in Norway, in many countries, you would find this. So I think it does, but that's a symptom of the problem. I mean, there's no doubt that, Canada's economic base has been very south focused towards the United States. And as you mentioned, the huge population, the majority of the population in Canada lives close to that. I think when you compare different regions, I mean, most Arctic experts will talk of different Arctics, the European Arctic, the North American Arctic. And of course, you can even distinguish within that. So, I mean, many of the climate dynamics and population dynamics in Alaska are quite different from what you find, say, in Baffin Island, et cetera. Again, the Great Circle routes, shipping, et cetera, there's just always been more access. During the Second World War, the Americans prospected Alaska quite thoroughly. So there's actually a pretty good sense of what's there when you talk about critical minerals, et cetera, oil and gas. So that's helped them as well. I don't think Canada's had quite the same extent of that. But I think it is a bit of just an issue of national neglect. We haven't made this a priority because there's only about 150,000 people there, so their political voices don't get heard to the same extent. And Canadians, most Canadians, have not had the opportunity to travel there or make it part of their plans. So I think there's quite a bit we can do. Again, this is where I think Greenland, which has faced some of the similar challenges, where we can look more together. And there is dynamism in certain industries, like, in fishing, et cetera. There's quite a bit that's, going on. But, again, as Canadians, I think we're at a moment where we need to think a little bit more about our country, think about our communities writ large, and how we can make for this to be, something that more Canadians experience while respecting the people who live there already. And, we don't have a university, right? I mean, Norway has a university above the Arctic Circle, right? I mean, we just lack some of the things that would give that extra push for technological innovation, et cetera. We have some good science in the marine sector. We have the Polar Knowledge Canada's research station in the north, but there's just much more we can be doing, I think, to, draw. And this is going to, it's been pointed out to me. I mean, you don't have economies of scale, right? So the sort of economics we've talked about, some people call neoliberal, very market driven, et cetera. You need creative forms of public-private intervention in the north. And I think that's led to a certain degree of neglect too, because most of our political leadership, Canada has been a very pro-free trade, very pro-free market economy. We need to think a little bit differently when it comes to the Arctic.
Alex Dalziel, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you, making us more aware of some of the issues that we've got in the north. You talked about it being a national project. You talked about being a national neglect. Hopefully, we'll change our attitudes toward the north. And thank you for assisting in that regard.
My pleasure, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from the north, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website and on social media as soon as the radio show goes to air. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it.